koutou katoa. Ko Adrian Miller toko wingama, ko Mangakiki toko manga, ko whangatiao toko awa, no tamaki makaurau aho, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Adrian Miller and I'm the General Manager New Zealand for the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, joining you today from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'd like on behalf of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet today and their deep connection to land, water and culture. And I also want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Have the next slide, please. I'd like to welcome you all here today on Wednesday, the 10th November to this Infrastructure Sustainability Council Future Focus Forum. Today on procurement, infrastructure that does more. This is one in a series of webinars we've run, one on policy, one on planning, and now this one on procurement. These 3 Ps are all about the front end and setting projects up for success. Today's session is being run as a webinar, and so none of you attendees need to worry at all about video or audio. It's all switched off. The Q&A has enabled those, so you should feel free to start putting questions in there right through the session. We'll start with a very quick intro from me on the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, and then hear from each of our panellists in turn before we move at the end to a Q&A session. We're very privileged to have here today with us Dean Kimpton, Transformation Director at the Construction Sector Accord. We also have, and he has also historically been the Chief Operating Officer for one of our key members, Auckland Council, New Zealand's largest council. We also have John Davies, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Constructors Association. And we have Leo Cocky, who's the Managing Director of the Office of Major Transport Delivery, or OMTID, in Western Australia, and Anne Davis, who's Special Counsel at Clayton Utz. So I think if we could have the next slide, and the one after that, thank you. So I thought I'd just start as at the very start, explaining how we as an organisation have a transformational agenda reflected in our purpose as an organisation, which is to ensure all infrastructure delivers quadruple bottom line impacts. Procurement's at the heart of how we achieve that transformational impact. Procurement's a strategic lever that all organisations, public and private, and even us as individuals, both in our private lives and professionally through what we do, can pull to achieve better outcomes in the space of people, planet and prosperity. Our strategic goals draw out these transformational aspirations, which are achieved through our rating tools, a framework that helps bring policy positions to life, our learning and development pathways, growing capability and capacity that matters. And on that note, some of you will see we recently launched a new course on this very topic of procurement. So feel free to check that out and we'll either drop that into the chat or provide it in a follow-up email. We also operate an iSupply online directory, and we role model and encourage collaboration, innovation and best practice across the sector, including partnering with and amplifying the efforts of other collaborative and inclusive organisations that are also leading the charge in this space. And some of them are here today as panellists. We recently released our 2021 impact report, showing how our own and our members' efforts have manifested via various impact pathways. And you can read more on that in our impacts report. Again, we'll drop that into the chat. On the right-hand side there of this slide, you'll see our impact model, which talks about how our various activities are brought to life. So if we could have perhaps the next slide now, Lauren, please. So I'd also like to just briefly touch on mandating practice and rating traction. So if you look at the slide on the right-hand side, you will see the various traction that's been achieved. The infographic shows the types of asset classes where rating has been undertaken, and then the type of rating undertaken. So we have obviously rating tools right across the life cycle of the asset, and then where those projects are geographically located. On the left-hand side of the slide, there's a map showing mandating practices across Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand, showing the value of above which mandating policies apply. So we have some really great mandating practices where the tool is being applied, which delivers benchmarking data and the ability to benchmark your project against others. And in terms of the magnitude of that, we've got over 200 billion either that has already undergone or is undergoing rating across a range of projects and 191 active projects plus. So I'm now going to turn to, if we could have the next slide, to Dean Kimpton. And Dean, I'd like to just maybe have you talk a little bit about your view on the subjects that we're talking about today and the power of procurement, particularly in the context of your work with the Construction Sector Accord, the genesis of the Sector Accord here in New Zealand, the work program, the various streams, obviously, that you're involved with, and where things are at on that. So handing over to you now, Dean.
Kia ora, and thank you very much, Adrian, and the team at Infrastructure Sustainability Council too. So I'm really pleased to be able to share my views and some of certainly my experiences. I'll use the Construction Sector Accord as the platform because that is the key change agent, but I'm going to draw in a few of my own observations built on governance roles I've got across major infrastructure investments in New Zealand and overseas. Can I just start off with acknowledging the topic, which is infrastructure procurement that does more? I see this debate, this issue occurring time and again, and it leads to frustration in all parties, communities, the customer, the client, the supplier. And if we don't get this right, it's just going to continue to result in underperformance or lack of return on that capital dollar spent. In other words, we just won't get the return on the other capitals, being social, environmental, cultural, or economic. So yeah, deep commitment to the topic. So thank you. Can I just talk a little bit about the Accord though to set the scene? So the Accord sprang out of a number of businesses, tier 1, tier 2 businesses in New Zealand going into liquidation. And the sector more generally failing to retain and attract the talent needed for New Zealand to achieve its built environment outcomes. Okay, and that's a sustainability failure in its own right. At the core of it was elements of failure in our procurement practice. And we're seeing that very much because there was an unbalanced or unrealistic allocation of risk, and that accentuated that instability that I just referred to. And the failure reflects on everybody, of course. There are also a number of hygiene factors that just weren't up to scratch in the New Zealand market. Flat productivity, a lack of investment in technology. There are other challenges like an ambiguous construction pipeline. And there were some deep frustrations in parts of the sector around the consents and approvals processes. Adding to that, when the government wanted to engage with the market, there's about 200 industry bodies, all with a voice on this. So that number generates noise and static rather than clarity. And so out of that was born an agreement between the government and the private sector to create what was then termed, and still is, the Construction Sector Accord. Simply put, it's an agreement between the private sector and the New Zealand government, of which we have 7 ministers, cabinet ministers, as signatories, to work together in a deep commitment to influence change, okay? And that inform and influence is going both ways. It's resulting in a trusted partner relationship, which is something we like to see in the sector full stop. And it's really come to the fore as a result of COVID, supply chain challenges, etc. Three, if I just summarise the Accord, there's lots I could tell you about it, but let me summarise the Accord simply in this way. Core purpose. First one is around people. So we know that we will not achieve the outcomes we're after unless we focus on building leadership within the sector and the capability and capacity across it. Culture sits strongly alongside of that. We know that we need a resilient sector. So people first, resilience sitting right alongside that. And we know that we need resilient businesses. So we've looked at things like pipeline certainty, procurement practice, regulatory approvals, health and safety and wellbeing. And then the third area that I would summarise as core purpose is around reputation. So if we're going to attract and retain the talent that we need to deliver the outcomes that New Zealand needs in turn, we need to be a great place. We need to attract the skills. We need to attract the investment for innovation. We need that diversity of thinking that comes from a robust, healthy sector. So I would summarise the Accord and all the things that it does around those three purposes. But I know that I've got limited time, so I want to zero in directly on this theme, infrastructure procurement that does more. So if I just digging into that and throwing out a few observations. First of all, I've just summarised these as the frustrations. So what were we seeing in the market? And remember, I'm not just talking about government procurers here, I'm talking about private sector procurers as well, because they have a role to play and improve procurement outcomes. The first one, and I can see it's becoming more and more of an issue, is the growth in the New Zealand market becomes more complex, and the outcomes that we're trying to balance and the trade-off decisions needed to support those becomes more complex. We've got to be a lot clearer on the strategic purpose of our projects, the why. We've got to be a lot clearer on the life cycle of that project. How will it adapt and perform over time, and then into the delivery of the project? So that was the first frustration that we've identified. Secondly, that led to, if we're not clear on the why and how this fits into broader outcomes, then it's very hard to define the outcomes expected in the project itself. We see the other frustrations really linked to being price dominated, risk allocation. I've mentioned that before, but it was a number of the contracts being signed and entered into for reasons that escape me sometimes. Just had completely unfair allocation of risk. And then we talked about price dominated, but once you become price dominated, you drive out little hope of leveraging those outcomes. So what did the construction sector Accord focus on? It's focused on a number of changes, I guess, linking outcomes into deliverables within the contract, okay? So social and environmental, cultural outcomes. It's focused on partnership as the underpinning behaviour and open communication. Irrespective of the form of contract, people typically align that with NEC or alliances, but it can happen in a straight price-based contract. If you don't have partnership, you don't have trust. If you don't have trust, then you're going to end up in dispute. Fair and transparent risk allocation. Talked about that a lot, but if we don't have that, then we haven't had the right conversation in the first place. So we've done a lot of work on that. Innovation and diversity of procurement model. So we're really trying to drive the intellectual property and the conversation from a one-size-fits-all to it's okay to have multiple models. Diversity of people in the sector, and that goes to that capability and capacity question. We're made up of many ethnicities in this country, and we just don't currently have the balance or that diverse spread of people, gender, ethnicity, skills and experience that reflect what we need to be successful. The other things that the Accord, and some of these are a little bit more technical, but have focused on to help support and drive change. Cash flow, payment terms, getting those sorted, getting them regular, and getting them agreed. And we've also focused on changes to the government procurement models to support these outcomes. So the Accord is there to influence and lead change, drive the right conversations, and bring a sustainable practice in infrastructure procurement, particularly, that influences not just delivery of the project, but influences environmental outcomes, carbon reduction, influences social outcomes. Suicide is twice the rate in the construction sector that it is in the balance of the population in New Zealand. So what are our wellbeing? What are our health and safety outcomes? Obviously cultural. So what are the expectations that our infrastructure and how it fits with our environment and fits with our culture is reflected in the way we design and deliver, and of course the economic benefits that we expect. I'm going to finish there, Adrian, because I'm mindful of time. All we're doing is seeding the discussion and the debate. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. So I'll if I can, I'll get John to turn on his video now. And John, what I'd really be interested to hear from you, obviously, what I was struck with is the similarities between the problems and issues on both sides of the Tasman. So a lot of what Dean had to say, I'm sure you'll have a view on too. I'm really interested in your perspectives on the construction sector's role in delivering more sustainable outcomes. You know, activities that are underway that will advance a more positive culture. I mean, Dean's just mentioned, I think, issues that you're dealing with too around wellbeing, suicide, diversity. So if we could hear about that and how you're approaching that. And in particular, I know your new culture standard, which I'm intrigued by, that you're planning on literally getting the procurement levers to be pulled on. So if we can hand over to you to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian, and good morning, everyone. Also like to thank Dean. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about echoes very much what Dean has just spoken about there. And really, we've got an interesting situation at the minute. We've got and it sounds cliche to say this, but it is really a once in a generation opportunity to really reform how we procure and deliver projects in this part of the world, or even internationally, because the problems are the same the world over. And what is that opportunity? What we have post-COVID pandemic is a situation where governments at all levels are relying on the construction industry to lead the economy forward. It's economics 101. Every dollar spent on infrastructure has a $3 kick on to the wider economy. So governments around the world are spending big on infrastructure. But the industry that they're relying on to do this economic heavy lifting is not in a great shape. And Dane touched on some of the things there. Here in Australia, the construction industry accounts for 25% of all business insolvencies. Only 12% of our workforce are women. And also, like Dean said, but slightly different skew on the statistic, our workers are 6 times more likely to die from suicide than they are from a workplace incident. And also, we have a big productivity issue. If we look at productivity growth over the last 30 years, construction lags other major industries by 25%. And again, sorry, I'm just going to put this in an Australian context here. But what does that actually mean? If we were just to half that gap, let's not get too ambitious, too carried away with ourselves here. Let's just target at halving that gap. Based on the volume of construction work that was undertaken in Australia last year, we could be constructing an extra $15 billion worth of infrastructure every single year for the same investment. That's 3 Western Sydney airports. That's 1 inland rail project every single year extra. Or to reframe that, if we look at the capability and capacity constraints that we have in the market at the minute, we could be doing a whole lot more with those existing resources and not need to bring in more resources. And that also factors into general wastage of resources as well, not just people, but materials as well. And so we've done a bit of work, as in ACA, Australian Constructors Association, as to how do we address this problem? How do we address these essentially sustainability issues for our industry? And quite interested to hear Dean talk there, because we've landed on a very sort of similar key themes. We've called them the 3 pillars of a sustainable construction industry. And all those 3 pillars are interlinked. And that is equitable and aligned commercial frameworks, sufficient capability, capacity, and skills, and an improved industry culture. And the example I give as to how all of those 3 things are interlinked is if we look at the commercial frameworks, the contracts that we've been utilizing to deliver projects over the last 10 years. They have driven a very adversarial culture within our industry. And now that adversarial culture is really impacting on our ability to attract and retain the people that we need to into the industry. In terms of that last point, culture, Adrian kindly mentioned that there's some good work happening in that space, and there really is. So the Australian Constructors Association is a partner in the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, along with the New South Wales and Victorian governments. Over the last 18 months, the CICT has worked on preparing a culture standard, which, if adopted, will drive significant improvements in industry culture. So what is a culture standard? Well, really, it is a document that looks at specific activities that need to happen to drive change in terms of industry culture. And it, again, three pillars are at the heart of that culture standard. And those 3 pillars are time for life, having more flexibility and working less hours, improved well-being, so focused on developing well-being initiatives, a bit like Mates in Construction or well-being in infrastructure here in Australia, and also looking to improve diversity and inclusion, back to that 12% of the workforce being women. We really want to improve that. How do we improve that? Well, the working hours and flexibility obviously will assist, but looking at some more basic things like addressing the gender pay gap, improving site conditions, even things as simple as PPE and having PPE that is appropriate for women and not expecting women just to wear PPE that's being developed for men over the last however many years. So what our hope is with this procurement, this culture standard, is that it will form part of government procurement going forward. So contractors will be required to comply with the culture standard as part of constructing a project going forward. This culture standard is currently out for engagement and feedback. And I really do encourage everyone that's dialed in today to go and have a look at that and to provide their feedback, because it really is such an important document and something that I don't believe has been done anywhere else in the world to date in terms of the construction industry. And you can do that by going to cultureinconstruction.com.au. But in terms of some other, briefly, just to finish up, some other initiatives that we're looking at, as well as the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, we're also part of the Construction Industry Leadership Forum. And that forum is looking at some more traditional things, looking at procurement, the role that procurement has to play in improving the sustainability of the industry. And specifically, we got to have a look at some issues here around how do we encourage digital? How we need to adopt construction contracts that promote open and transparent sharing of information so that digital technologies can start to be adopted. And we need to move to more performance-based specifications rather than these very prescriptive specifications that we currently use that provide no opportunity for innovation. And just finally, one of the things that we're doing, we're saying, federal government, you've got a role to play in all of this as well. You are providing and coughing up quite a bit of money for this infrastructure, but you're not putting any preconditions on how that money is spent. We've seen Infrastructure Australia launch their infrastructure plan. We agree with all of the recommendations in there. And we're calling for the federal government to play a more active role, to coordinate reform and to incentivize reform so that we start to see some real progress. Because the time for action is now. We can't afford to wait another 5 years, another 10 years. The problems that we are facing are now, and the requirement to deal with them because of the reliance on the industry is now. So with that, Adrian, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks so much, John. I couldn't agree more. Those green strings and the power of procurement is critical if we're going to get action on climate particularly and decarbonisation. So I'm now going to hand over now to Leo Kopi, who's going to speak to us about his experience in Western Australia. My chief executive described them as being a pioneer in terms of picking up and measuring performance and corresponding outcomes. So Leo, if you could just tell us a little bit about that, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Perth. Yeah, just a bit of background. I've been working with Main Roads West Australia for over 40 years, and predominantly over 20 years of that's been in the procurement and delivery phase of our major road projects. And just recently, about 18 months ago, the organisation called Untitled was set up, which is basically a JV of two government agencies to deliver road and rail projects. So the rail projects, major rail projects, which is our Metronet program, has been added. And so at the moment, we're sort of, the organisation's been delivering a number of major projects. I think we've got about 20 on our books at the moment, and all of those have got the DISCO rating tool embedded in those contracts. Just to set a bit of background, that we've been on this journey for a little while. In fact, I started, well, about 15 years ago, we would have been venturing into the Alliance form of contracts. There was a $500 million project, and in the with alliances, we were looking to do more than just building road and bridges. We were looking to achieve a lot of social outcomes, environmental outcomes, and getting the community a lot more involved in our works. And so we had about 40 or 50 objectives, social, soft objectives, I suppose, that we were trying to drive in the alliance to reward the contractors for achieving some of those outcomes. But we were struggling to find a way to bundle them together, to measure them, and to put a bit of sense or framework around it all. So we were fortunate, I suppose, a few years later to see the DISCO rating tool coming on the scene. And so we grabbed it because we saw it as a great way to add to our alliance in contracting framework, basically, where we could drive these other outcomes. Some of the lessons we've been, well, I suppose one of the other things we learned is that the rating tool helped us make better balanced decisions. There were a number of times we would have been facing, for example, environmental challenges. We could optimise cut to fill on a job. Cutting means clearing more land, but the flip side of that is we'd be reducing the cost of works, but not more importantly, having to reduce the amount of resources being consumed. And clearly an impact on the community as well with the transport. So that's just an example. So we saw the tool as a way of helping us to make better balanced decision making rather than just an economic one or just an environmental one or just a social one. So it gave us that opportunity as well. The other thing, what the tool does in my mind is it gives the project team the license to take time out to focus on sustainable outcomes. As we all know, these infrastructure projects, we're focusing on quality, we're focusing on time, and we're focusing on, everyone's focusing on cost. But by embedding this the tool of the sustainability initiatives into our contracts, it gives a license for the team to take time out to actually look at doing things differently to create social and environmental value without having to cost more, or may even sometimes cost less. Some of the examples that we experienced, we were able to create wetlands by sourcing fill material from nearby locations. So that was, in effect, we saved money, but added to the environmental social value, environmental value to the area. So another one was creating a playing field by removing the limestone outcrops. So we worked with council and cleared a site, resource limestone, which is great for our road building side, but it provided an opportunity for the councils to build playing grounds. So it's just going about doing things differently by creating a lot more value. Obviously, being able to focusing on contracting local businesses and Aboriginal businesses, or giving employment opportunities to long-term unemployed or local Aboriginal people. This changed lives, improved the quality of life for many. So it's just a bit of a focus, a bit of time, but it drove contractors to do more. The other thing, I suppose, the other message I'd like to get across is that the ESCO rating tool is just that. It's a tool. It's important to remember that without the strong leadership driving sustainable outcomes and a team culture committed to sustainability, contract clauses and rating tools that are embedded in the contract are destined to fail. The leadership, as always, starts from the top, and in my case, that's me and my leadership team. The client organisation needs to drive it. The contractor's organisation and its project director needs to drive it. The project team's leadership need to drive it. Ultimately, the contractor's workforce needs a buy-in, and great results are only achieved when the team culture and sustainability is right. So again, it's just a tool, but without the leadership and the right culture, it will achieve nothing. Often I hear the rating tool fails to deliver, and therefore it's a waste of money. And my first thoughts are that the project leaders do not really understand the value of sustainable outcomes. And that's where we need to sort of intervene, I suppose, and draw that out. Our projects are designed to benefit our community, and that means more than just building infrastructure. How we go about building that infrastructure can provide much, much more to the quality of our lives and that of our next generations. So setting the right rating targets is fundamental. Sometimes people just pick a number and add it into the contracts without truly understanding what effort's required to achieve those targets. And some of the targets are quite high because that project has the attributes to achieve it. And some others are set at a lower target because of the attributes of that project. You don't want to lose a team because the target's too much of a stretch, but likewise, you don't want to set too soft one. Otherwise, as I said, people call it a waste of time and money. So we don't just blindly add clauses in contracts. There needs to be a fair amount of consideration going to how it's embedded in those contracts. So just as a final statement, I just wanted to say driving sustainability in our contracts is good business. It's infrastructure projects provide that more than just transport solutions. By spending some time at looking at things differently with our sustainability spectacles on, we create opportunities to improve our environment, the amenity of where we live, provide the changing experiences and employment for those that find it difficult to get a start. We contribute a major way to our circular economy, thereby saving resources and reducing landfill waste. And there are many, many more examples of what we can do. So as I said, this is good business. It's good business because contractors' reputations can be enhanced, and therefore clients see them as contractors of choice. Our government see us solving a number of their challenges, and therefore more inclined to fund our projects, especially when we're competing for funds. The next generation of talented employees will want to work for us, but it accords with their values. So sustainability in our industry attracts the best talent. And finally, what we do is good for all of us and the generations that follow us. So thank you for that. And I look forward to some questions later on.
Thanks so much, Leo. That's great. I love the concept of balancing license to take time out to consider broader outcomes, and that whole issue around doing more, which we agree 100% has a massive payback across a number of areas. So if we could now perhaps have you, Leo, to turn your camera off, and we'll have Anne turn hers on. And I'd like you to perhaps just give us a little bit of an introduction into your thoughts around the work I know you're doing around contractualization of sustainability outcomes, a little bit of an insight into the high level findings from your research to date, how that's playing out now, and how you think contractualization could be playing out in the future. So handing over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Adrienne. I can see we have a sustainable location here because the lights have gone out, so because I haven't moved enough. We'll leave it at that. But yes, so I'm an infrastructure lawyer working in procurement, front-end infrastructure, large projects, and have done since 2003 when I joined Clayton Utz. And back then we didn't have a rating tool. And I remember first finding out about ISK or its predecessor when I did some pro bono work, which was a great privilege for the organisation. And then I became a director for 5 years from 2009 to 2014. So that's how I became interested in ISK. And having been an infrastructure lawyer since those days, before ISK, there was always that burning idea of how do we bring sustainability? Because of course we were thinking about it for many decades before the ISK rating tool arrived. How do we bring it into the contracts that we are preparing, spending all of this time on these thousands of pages of documentation? And then we thought of the rating tool system. Well, not me, but people did. And I was excited to come across it and get involved. And what I've been interested to see over the last period, since 2009 and the birth of, the beginnings of building the rating tool, is the definition of what sustainability has become so much broader. And I can hear that in my colleagues and how they're talking about wellness and lifestyle and all of these things, as well as materials and resources and how we construct things. These things are integrated, and this is great. So that's why I started off with this slide in talking about the broadness of sustainability and these two definitions from the UN World Commission and then from University of California, Los Angeles, very broad definitions of what sustainability is. And that's very important because that informs the breadth of the rating tool, as I've noticed, which goes to everything, as I said, from governance right through to materials and resources and how we work. So the rating tool, as I'm doing some research, I have been doing the preliminary studies this year and talking to people to frame my research question for the project that I'll be doing academically. And in doing that, because I'm interested in ISK, I'm interested in the rating tool, but it's also been very interesting to see the IS essentials coming to life, being considered. And this is the new thing where we're not only talking about the 100 million plus or the 50 million plus as it is in some, even 15 million in New Zealand, but smaller projects than that. Because of course, the low hanging fruit is the big projects, of course. And I remember thinking that at the time, my goodness, look at all this concrete. We can make changes to that. And so with the essentials, for example, clients of mine like the City of Sydney have a lot of projects in that $5 to $50 million range, but not a lot of the 100 million. They don't do that sort of project in the city. That's a state government or a federal government or New Zealand government, program. So this is very exciting because while we've got the low-hanging fruit of the big projects and people are on board and state governments have jumped on and made mandatory the ISK, we now need to think about these other projects which are happening everywhere, every day. So that's where I've been talking to people on projects in regions, both in New Zealand and Australia, and talking about how it's going with ISK. And what I found is that people are saying, gee, yeah, we have a rating, we have it for $100 million projects, but not for our smaller projects in the regions. Here comes the essentials. That's why it's so exciting. So, and what they're also saying is, well, you might have a rating, but how do you enforce that? Yes, people will be in breach, as a lawyer says, under the contract, but are you really going to do anything to sue for damages for breach against a rating tool? So that's where we've seen the contractualization has included things like KPI incentives. So there's some sort of reward system as opposed to, oh, we have to think about this, as one of my colleagues, I think it was Dean, mentioned, the adversarial nature of our environment as it can be. We have to think more collaboratively and more about rewards. And that's another thing that's been happening over the last 10 years. I've seen collaborative contracting, not just through alliancing, as Leo correctly mentioned, but also just generally collaborative contracting. More generally is the flavour, and this is wonderful to see, and I believe sustainability is helping, and people's interest in it is helping drive that. So my research, and if we can go to the next slide now, Adrian, that's great. So it has led me to look at policies throughout different jurisdictions, and two I just want to touch on. There's in New South Wales, there's an integrated planning and reporting framework for local government. And this talks about sustainability right through it. Now, as I said, so many of the projects in local government are too small to get an ISC rating at the moment, but that would not be the case if there was an IS Essentials. So that's really good. And there's certainly this mechanism. This is through the actual Local Government Act that it's mandated that there has to be integrated planning and reporting. The Act was amended, I think, in 2016, and the Integrated Planning and Reporting Guidelines came out in September this year to assist local government to understand what that means and how to bring it about. So that's in New South Wales. In Victoria, I've been lucky enough to be working on a project down there, the North East Link project, and not only are they getting an ISC rating, but also they have this whole social procurement framework in Victoria. And of course, that's in other states as well. But the SPF in Victoria is very comprehensive, and it talks about direct purchasing of goods, etc. But it also has an indirect element, which really brings in sustainability. And it talks about social and sustainable procurement. So I've been very excited to see what's happening in Victoria. And what it's led me to think about is to look at my research, which I'll start next year, now that I've been doing all this preliminary setting up, is going to look at benchmarking what is good procurement practice in this smaller range, in this 5 to 50, maybe up to 100, where we haven't been able to get ratings because, well, the rating tool hasn't been suited to it. And now if there's going to be an IS Essentials, what's happening? What are the benchmarks that should be achieved to ensure that we get sustainability into those smaller projects, small to medium? I mean, they're not that small, they're critical. And yes, I've been looking at those policies and looking at how IS rating works with them. And I'm just so delighted to be able to have this opportunity to share, and hopefully next year to talk about my actual research when I started.
Thanks, Anne. I think that's a fabulous introduction to the whole idea of contractualisation, and we look forward with interest to what you conclude in due course. So if I could have all the panellists please return now, and I just want to remind everybody that you're welcome to add questions. We have a few in here, but not that many, so keep asking some more. I'd like to kick off with a question to all panellists around a question that Dean introduced and I think John elaborated on, which is that whole looking beyond the economic. How do we get the procurers or the proponents, as we often call them at ISC, to move beyond that cost lens to broader outcomes, what I'd like to call green strings, particularly given the magnitude of investment that John mentioned. So open to you all to answer that question. Would you like to start, John? You were nodding.
Yeah, more than happy to start, Adrian. I think one of the things I'd like to point out, draw people's attention to, is a piece of work that the Construction Industry Leadership Forum is doing. Just a reminder, that's ACA, New South Wales and Victoria. One of the key streams that they're looking at is coming up with a framework for better defining value for money, because for too long we have viewed, or government delivery agencies in particular, have viewed value for money just purely and simply through the lens of lowest possible price at the tender box. And as we all know, especially from a government standpoint, that there's so much more to value for money than just how much the project is supposed to cost, because that's another thing that it's one thing the price went at the tender box, but we all know also that ultimately quite often that's not the price that ends up being paid. So I think it's really important that this piece of work is being done, because once you've got that value for money framework, you can introduce lots of different components and weight lots of different components, like environmental sustainability, obviously. And we've been talking as well more recently back to this capability and capacity problem, that we could actually incentivize innovation and improvements in productivity as well. But I think the other important point to note here is, in terms of government procurement agencies, is that it's all well and good saying, all of us saying, you know, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. They need to be given the tools to do that. They need to be trained in doing things differently, because as Anne sort of talked about before around collaborative forms of contract, you know, we've been pushing very strongly for collaborative forms of contract, and that doesn't necessarily mean alliances. That could be more collaborative forms of lump sum D&C. But the problem we've got is that the delivery agency says, yeah, no, that's fine. We agree with that. And they ask their people down the line to go off and do that. And if you sort of take New South Wales, for example, I can just picture the poor people in those delivery agencies opening up the contract cupboard and going, right, oh, we've been told we need more collaborative forms of contract. What we got in here in the cupboard? Well, we've got GC21, we've got GC21, and we've got GC21. And by the way, we've got to get this out to market in the next 10 weeks. What are we going to do? Well, GC21 it is. So, you know, we've got to give them the tools to be able to follow through with what we all agree is needed.
That's great, John. Dean, you obviously look like you've got something else to add there too. So we'll perhaps hand that over, the speaking mic over to you.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. I think this is a really, really important question. So well done on asking it. Having worked in the government sector, to me, the greatest opportunity to drive value for money is understanding what our community actually needs in the form of infrastructure that we're proposing. And we're not clear on the why and how it fits with those broader community outcomes or national outcomes, then we'll never be able to define the outcomes we expect through the contract, and therefore what the benefits are, and therefore how we will measure them. So I'm a great advocate in making sure that we've got a clear why, and that we understand how we leverage that capital dollar through the infrastructure investment into those other outcomes. And then you can really focus on, as John was talking about, well, now how do we measure value for money through the contract itself? But the most gains are done at that strategic planning level, which is where I think Infrastructure Sustainability Council can really challenge client organisations to think that through well before you get anywhere near a procurement document. And then, like I said, I think I don't want to repeat what John said, because I agree with everything that John's outlined. I just want to pick up that front end piece. Okay.
It's great, Dean. Thank you. I think we are more than happy to help with that, and we can indeed do so. And I have actually dropped into the chat for those that are interested some work that's been done around return on investment, which actually goes to that very issue of how we consider the payback in terms of the investment that's made in the use of the tool. And I think, Leo, you touched on this, so maybe I'll hand to you. You did make some comments, and I think it's one of the resistances. We don't only get resistance at times from the procurement side, we also sometimes get it from the sector, this resistance around the old way of doing things. And John talked about pulling the old contracts out of the cupboard. So I'm really interested in your take, Leo, on the cost of delivery. So, you know, there can be reticence around that it actually costs more to deliver. We're not sure that's the case because we think there are a whole lot of savings. So maybe, Leo, you could talk to that issue.
Yeah, no, I was just going to comment. What we do is actually do incentivise the outcomes you want. So that's the point Anne was making earlier, that we are looking for ways to measure and incentivise. So when we set the KPIs, we have a number of KPIs that we follow, but 3 or 4 of them on a particular project we'll incentivise with a significant amount of money. So, for example, we are driving the Aboriginal employment and engaging in Aboriginal business at the moment, and we set some targets in that space, and we put substantial amount of money. We're not afraid to use figures of $1 or $2 million as a driver. That there are numbers that contractors understand, and we call it coming out of a performance pool rather than a margin. So when you think about $1 million as a pool, that's straight to your profit line. So people understand that language. That means it's like winning a $10 million contract. So we use those drivers. Obviously, we have a pretty good relationship with industry, so we keep asking industry, tell us where the client's the problem. Are we building in things into our contract that stops you from achieving those goals? And even if it's dollars, sometimes it's going to cost more to get there. Let us know what the extra dollar is if you haven't built it into your contract. We'll then decide whether it's value for money to vary that contract by that amount of money. So we try to be collaborative, and so that A, we're not the blockers, B, our contracts are not the blockers. And sometimes even before the contract's awarded, we sort of prepare the groundwork, so to speak. So we will engage with the Aboriginal community in that area, for example, and see what groundwork we need to do so that the contractor can come on, when it comes on board on contract, can actually tap into it. Because that's the other issue we're finding. We set some pretty tight timelines for contractors. Not only the job's complex enough as they are, and obviously the dollars are tight, but we're giving them impossible timelines, and a lot of these initiatives that we want to achieve that needs a fair amount of lead time. And so if we can do some of that groundwork before we award the contracts and then tap into it. So yeah, there's some of the things we do, especially if we focus on a couple of 2 or 3 particular initiatives we want in our contracts. So currently, I mentioned Aboriginal work, sort of encouraging diversity of employments and long-term unemployed, getting those people into our jobs. We're focusing on the circular economy. Again, if you do the groundwork, there's lots of money out there. It's not necessarily in our contracts, but there's a lot of agencies looking to sort of tap into vehicles to deliver their outcomes that they're trying to achieve, what they've been mandated to do. So as soon as we come along as an opportunity and we work collaboratively with them, that we become a team, and money seems to be less of an issue, believe it or not, because other agencies have money but looking for places to invest to drive the social outcomes or the environmental outcomes we're looking for. So it just means a lot more groundwork.
Yeah, that's such
and
an
be serious from the client side. Yeah.
Yeah, that whole issue of where the cash comes from, it might not necessarily come from the procurer of the asset. It might come from an ancillary government agency that's also looking to drive outcomes. And as you say, the project is just a vehicle for that. I'd like to just perhaps pass on to another question. A number of you have mentioned diversity. I am conscious, Anne, I haven't come back to you, but don't worry, I will. I am really interested in particularly, I mean, we're obviously on both sides of the Tasman looking at a range of dimensions of diversity, including gender, but I'm really interested in what we think the Indigenous viewpoints can bring to our sector. So I'm interested in how they're being procured, and I know that in Australia and even here in New Zealand, the procurement levers have been pulled to seek to deliver some of those outcomes. So I'm just interested in hearing what you all think about that Indigenous perspective and what it brings. Anybody want to take that question?
I'm happy to speak to that. Yeah, and just in relation to the previous question, as you can probably see from my research and how I started it, policy is critical. And I think policy has changed, and that's where we'll move from economics to a broader view, hence my broad definition of sustainability, which I think is all wrapped up. But moving on to the current question, Adrian. Look, the Indigenous view is so critical in our nations, and I've had the good fortune to be approached by some Indigenous organisations because they see that I'm interested in social procurement. I've spoken to people and my contact's been given, and they've been saying, how do we get involved? We're trying to contact state governments. We are an Indigenous organisation. And we're trying to get in on the procurement, and it's very difficult because it's how to win that first project for these small organisations. They are deeply embedded with country. They have a different view of the world and what we need. And it is such a beautiful worldview. And what I see is that we need to work with them, to Indigenous communities, to understand their view so that we can embed that in our projects and involve them in it from the very beginning, from the procurement. And that's why I was so excited to see the social procurement framework in Victoria and how it so talks, it's so important, the Indigenous viewpoint in that framework, in that policy. So I won't take any more time, but I'm very interested in the Indigenous view and this idea of country that they see and the connection with it.
I have to agree, and I'm also fascinated with the connections and the interconnectedness of people and the environment. So I don't know whether any of the other participants would like to contribute to that question. If not, I'm conscious that we are running quite close. Oh, Dean, you want to say something?
Oh, well, look, can I just reinforce what you were saying, Anne? I think what we have is a pretty stereotypical approach to the design and delivery of infrastructure. And what we're learning more and more here in New Zealand is we balance our Western worldview of that with the Te Ao Māori worldview. There's a really neat intersect around how we respect and provide stewardship for our physical, for our receiving environment. That's both land and water and air, of course. And procurement, so we can build economic and financial sustainability in those communities. But the interesting one, and I really appreciated the discussion yesterday, Adrian, and you were in it, with the Building Advisory Panel, which is an advisory board to government here, in design, and in particular, how we define the codes by which design must comply. And if we can get, it's a policy equivalent, but if we can influence our codes to allow Indigenous design to occur without it being caught right at the starting point, then we achieve a whole other set of outcomes. So I think there's a really interesting opportunity in there if we just step back and allow different worldviews influence us. Sorry, Adrian, I know you're under pressure.
No, fantastic answer. I think that's so true, and richness too, and for all of us really, in what we have in our communities and our built environment. So look, I'm conscious of time, and Sally will tell me off if I run over. So actually what I'd like to do now is actually ask all of you to do a very brief, like couple of, half a minute, of what you see as the critical takeout that you want people to take away from today. So if I can perhaps, I'm actually going to start with you, Leo. Literally under a minute, please.
Okay, then. Just the takeaway for me is that this rating tool is a fantastic tool to use to drive the outcomes we want. We just need to understand its potential, and it's useless without the strong leadership and building of the team culture that goes with it.
Great. Leadership, culture, strength of the tool. John.
Culture. We need to change the culture of our industry. You all have a role to play in all of this. I ask you all to get informed and to challenge the status quo.
Great. I think we all have action to take. Dean.
I want John's answer.
You're allowed to endorse it. You're into collaboration.
Yeah. I just think it's the culture with which how we approach our people, our communities, how we do business with each other. I love the outcomes focus and teasing that into how we'll actually do what we say we're going to do, and the partnership that sits under that. And if you get that right, you're more likely to get the rest is just an output.
Great answer, Dean. Thank you. And Anne, I'm going to give you the parting word. And as a fellow lawyer, I know it's always important to have the last word. So I'm going to hand that over to you for the last word, and then I'll close out.
Yes. Thanks, Adrian. I concur with each of my colleagues on what you've said. Look, I just think that this new tool, the IS Essentials, is going to be a game changer because, as I said, low-hanging fruit, the big projects are on board, but the smaller projects, they're not only important in themselves, but because they are in the regions, in the local communities. This is local government work where people are more connected. We do feel, you know, in our local neighbourhood, we're very connected. So I see great opportunity in this IS Essentials tool going forward. But I agree, it's going to be about connectivity and collaboration and making that happen.
Great. Okay, look, thank you everybody so much for participating here today, and especially a big thanks to our panelists for some fantastic contributions. And on that note, I'm going to actually close this out at 1:30. Sally will be pleased with me. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.